preached a sermon one time called God is Great, but I'm No Good. And a lot of the first section of the book focuses on this idea that, yeah, I know that God is awesome, God is holy, God is incredible, but I'm stuck in this place of feeling like I'm never good enough. So a lot of Christians live in this place of mediocrity, just good enough. But a lot of people live in a place of condemnation, never be good enough. So one of the things that is really interesting about Elisha's life is that the first thing that God checked when he was calling Elisha wasn't whether or not Elisha was able to do what God was calling him to do, because he wasn't. God knew that. Elisha knew that. When God called Elisha out of the field, he didn't check to see if Elisha was able, but to see if Elisha was available. And that's why the first step that Elisha made toward God was to not only follow after Elijah, which represented God's purpose for his life, but to actually burn his plows. So he had nothing to go back to, because the first step to being used by God for greater things, before you can even walk through that doorway, before you can even enter into what God has for you, you've got to be surrendered. I actually was reading about how when Paul McCartney first called George Martin, who was the producer that the Beatles had worked with for so long, and asked him to produce the Abbey Road album, he said, "I want you to produce it." And George Martin said back, "Are you gonna let me produce it the way we used to produce it?" It's like a lot of stuff had grown up in the Beatles world, which was larger than life, all these conflicts and all of these different elements of drama. And so the producer wanted to know, before we even get in the studio, are you going to let me produce this album? Are you going to take your hands off of certain things? Are you going to get in line? And I think God says that to each one of us, because we're like, "Oh God, I want you to use my life in a greater way." Yeah, I believe God has greater things for me, my marriage, my business, my future. And God as a producer is like, well, if we're going to do this, you're going to have to let me have the ultimate control. You're going to have to be what we would call surrendered to God's process. Now, here's an interesting New Testament parallel to the story of Elisha. We've got a man in a field who burns his plows. In the New Testament, in Romans chapter 11, there's this great passage all about how great God is. Oh, the depth of the wisdom, of the riches and knowledge of God, how unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord, and who has been his counselor? Who has ever given to God that God should repay him? For from him and through him and to him are all things, and all of the glory belongs to him forever. Amen. Now I love that passage. It's all about God is great, God is great, God is great. But then you get to Romans chapter 12, verse 1, and you see our response to that, where Paul says, I'm talking about Paul the Apostle, not Sir Paul McCartney here, I'm talking about a different Paul. He says, "Therefore, I want you to offer your bodies, in view of God's mercy and how great he is, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, so that it can be acceptable. And this is your spiritual act of worship." The first thing that God is calling you to, in order to fulfill a greater purpose in your life, is a greater posture of surrender. I tell the story in the book about my plow burning ceremony. Actually, for me, it was CDs. It was all the music that I had collected as a teenager. And when God really got a hold of my life, man, it was like I needed to let go of that part of my life in order to embrace the new part of my life. And I felt like God was calling me to do this crazy thing, to burn my whole CD collection, because it represented this life for me that was apart from God. And not only what the songs were, and by the way, I didn't burn any Beatles CDs, so I wasn't sacrilegious or anything like that standing here in Abbey Road Studios, but I did. I invited all my friends out, and I tell the story of how, as those CDs went up in flames, I felt like, as I smelled the burning plastic, I was also sensing that God had greater things in store for me in the future. Now, the point of that story isn't that everybody should go out and burn their music, but I wonder if before we journey any further into this experience, you need to acknowledge a few things about how great God is, how he surpasses everything else in the world that you could aim for or aspire to, and that you'll never be great on your own. When Jesus called us to do greater things in John 14:12, he wasn't calling us to be greater than him. He was calling us to be greater through him, by his power living inside of us, so we could do greater things for his glory. Now, before you go on to do the greater things, you've got to deal with the question, am I sacrificed and surrendered to God? And when I say that, is there an area of your life, maybe as you were reading this week, or maybe even as I'm speaking now, that's coming up in your mind where you're like, I need to burn that plow, that connection to a part of my life that I haven't given completely over to God? Usually we know what those things are, and then there's some other things we'll tell people, but there's some real things we're dealing with. I just believe before we go any further, before we even can enter in, before God can begin to make something greater out of our life, before we can step into the life that we're wanting, we've got to give God all of the life that we have, because he gave it to us to begin with. Have you given control of each of those areas of your life over to God? See, when you realize how great God is, it shouldn't create a sense of condemnation. God is great, but I'm no good. That's where so many people live. Actually, it could create, if you hear this correctly, a powerful sense of affirmation. Like, because God is great, and because he is so great, he can take someone like me who, apart from him, can do no good and do greater things through me. That's part of the breakthrough of the message of greater, is that we can walk right into this gap between how great we know that God is and the great things that we believe he's calling us to do, and know that Jesus has filled the gap. It's through surrender, not through condemnation, but through a sense of dedication, where Elisha slaughtered not only his animals as a sacrifice, but he slaughtered the very instruments that the animals pulled, just to say, I'm never going back. You know, it's interesting to me, that's not the only time that happened in the Bible. When Jesus called the disciples, I remember how the first thing that he asked them to do was to let him use their boat, which is really interesting because in Matthew chapter 14, Jesus walks out to the disciples on water. So Jesus didn't really need a boat. Have you ever thought about that? Jesus didn't ask Peter, hey, can I borrow your boat, because he needed a mode of transportation. But he wanted to test Peter's sense of surrender and trust. Can I use your boat? Maybe that's what God is saying to you today. Will you burn your plows? Can I use your boat? Will you offer yourself as a living sacrifice? And here's the beauty of it. God doesn't take things away from our life because he's hateful or spiteful. I thought that for so long, that God just wanted to rip all the pleasure and joy out of my life. I think that's why sometimes so many teenagers have a hard time giving their life over to God in this surrendered way. It's because they believe that God came to beat them down. But I believe he speaks into our life to raise us up. I believe that's what it's all about. You know, as I think through my childhood, I remember how one Christmas I wanted an Atari. Some of you watching this will have no idea what that is, but others of you will know exactly. Frogger and Donkey Kong and games like that. I wanted an Atari so bad. My neighbors had this Atari. I would go over and play it all the time. And I asked my parents for an Atari, but I woke up Christmas morning and I was shocked to find under the tree, because I really didn't think they would get me an Atari. I knew it was expensive. They had got me a Nintendo. But it was like, here I am thinking Atari. Mom and Dad are thinking Nintendo. Nintendo was so much better than Atari. I was the first one in the neighborhood who got a Nintendo. It's like all my friends wanted to be over all the time. It was amazing to me, even as a child, how it registered to me that my parents were trying to give me something better than I even knew to want for myself, or knew how to ask for myself. That's why Ephesians 3:20 says he's able to do immeasurably more than we could ask or imagine, according to his power. He is great, and he wants greater things for me than I can imagine for myself. So when I take a posture of surrender, when I say, God, here it is, you're the producer, tell me what to play. You're my leader, tell me where to go. You're my commander and overseer in my life. I'm completely surrendered to you, that God has the ability to lead us into great places. And it really comes down to hearing the voice of God. That's a lot of what the message of the book is. God will call different people to do different things, but it's always something greater. And it's not necessarily that when you embrace God's greater vision for your life, you're always going to quit your job, sell everything, move away, or make a major life transition. Sometimes it's that God is going to call you to do what you're already doing in a greater way, with greater dependency on Him. When you think about hearing the voice of God, one of the things that is really crazy from all the rock music that I played when I was like growing up, and even now I listen to my music so loud. The other day, I realized that there was this crazy ringing in my ear, and I went to the doctor to ask him if something was wrong. I felt like I'd lost a little bit of my hearing, and they did all these tests, and it turned out I had lost a little bit of my hearing, just in some certain frequencies. But when I was going through that process, getting my hearing tested and seeing if something wrong with my hearing, it was a scary thing. I learned something about God. See, the doctor told me when I came in, he said, actually, the ringing in your ears is a good thing. He said the ringing in your ears might be annoying, but it's actually proof that you still have some hearing left. When the ringing goes away, that means that your hearing has completely died. The ringing is telling you that it's still alive. I would say to you today, maybe there's a spiritual ringing in your spiritual ears. You know, Hebrews chapter 3 says, today, if you hear God's voice, don't harden your heart. Respond to Him in obedience. You can still get your hearing back. If you're hearing God speak to you, feeling the vibrations of the sounds around you, there's something that God wants to build. So before we move any deeper into this experience, before we go any closer to seeing what greater things God has for you, let's just make up our minds right now to accept His ways, which are higher than our ways, and His thoughts, which are higher than our thoughts, and say, God, I'm open to your greater plan for my life, whatever that may be. You call me to burn the plows, I'm burning them. You want to use my boat, you can use it. Here I am, a living sacrifice, completely available to you. And when you do that, you can walk straight into the door, knowing that Jesus has bridged the gap, accepting once and for all His perfect performance on your behalf, and then beginning to see Him use your life for greater things than you ever imagined.